With those public service announcements over, let's begin the session. So throughout the day, we've had some references to issues around sexual identity, gender orientation and gender expression in Indonesia. I think that's been tantalising you, and now at this final session, we have the opportunity to hear from two genuine experts on these issues, two fabulous researchers and activists. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Saskia Wieringa from the University of Amsterdam. I don't think Saskia needs a great deal by way of introduction. Her work has enriched and deepened our understanding of gender issues and issues around sexuality and sexual identity in Indonesia for several decades now. Our second speaker is Hendri Yulius. Hendri's published widely on issues related to gender identity in Indonesia. He's the author of Coming Out. And you heard it here first. He's working on a monograph at the moment, which will be called, or has the working title of Intimate Assemblages, Identities of LGBTI, the politics of LGBTI identity in Indonesia. So that book will be out soon. Keep an eye out for it. Without any more ado, it's my great pleasure to first welcome Saskia. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me all thank the organizers for inviting me here. I've got a great time here, listening to all of you and being among this great community of scholars. And I really appreciate very much the invitation to come here. And particularly, of course, to talk about the topic of the recent wave of homophobia, which is so strong this time, and what it may mean. And I mean, your invitation made me realize, made me reflect on what's going on, actually. I mean, I've been trying to fight and understand this campaign of homophobia. And actually, a few days ago, there was a mention in the Jakarta Post that Neno Warisman, one of the organizers of the Ganti Presiden campaign, she said that, we should vote against Jokowi, because we must prevent, if we don't do that, then our children can become homosexuals, right? That was not the first time that Jokowi was targeted. Already a year ago, in September 2017, there was a red scare against Jokowi, and that was also not the first time, in which he was accused of being descended from communists. And we all know that the communist virus is very important, and that you can inherit the communist violence, right? Also because he was cooperating with China, so he must clearly be a communist. Already in 2014, he was accused of having Chinese ancestry. So these kinds of scares, the red scare, the gay scare, LGBT scare, are being used for political purposes. So my question at some stage was, what is going on here? I mean, this is not just directed at LGBT people. There's something wider going on here. Is this perhaps a political smokescreen? And reflecting further, I realized that this was the second time that the sexual moral panic is being used and is being whipped up for political purposes. The first time was around 1965, when young girls belonging to the socialist communist family were accused of having castrated and killed the generals. I will show a few little things over there in a sec. And this is the second time. And what we see is that there are a number of players in the field. First of all, of course, the religious hardliners, who are very happy to promote their own agenda of intolerance. But there's also, I mean, by talking about people's bedrooms, there's a deviation of political discussion from socio-economic policies. I mean, there's no discussion, actually, or very little discussion in this political campaign, the presidential elections, about what the candidates actually want for Indonesia as far as socio-economic policies goes or human rights goes, but they discuss bedroom concerns. And of course, everybody is all worked up about that and forget to ask them about what has Jokowi done with this country, right? Or what are the plans of Prabowo? But first of all, I think it's important to ask ourselves, was Indonesia actually ever or always so LGBT friendly? Because we have this idea, most of us have been seeing Waria around, and all of us, I think, have been seeing adolescent boys holding hands, but it's only in the eye of the beholder to see any form of homosexuality, particularly in a Western beholder, to see a form of homosexuality in boys just being friends and holding hands. There's no homosexual connotation in that. But still the idea is, and I just quote one of the prominent people saying that, former Human Rights Chief Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein, that he's talking about the wave of homophobia. Recent discussions on criminalization, which I will talk about and which already was addressed today, betray strains of intolerance seemingly alien to Indonesian culture. But are they really alien? That's my question. So is this homophobic campaign an anomaly, right? I mean, it started all this bitter campaign from the end of 2015 at universities when LGBT students were being banned and when sex education was being banned. And it became immediately, and I'll show some pictures later, linked with communist phobia. As if in some strange way, LGBT people were all also communist and communists were also gay. Yeah, I'll show you a slide. And this happened after a period of increasing visibility of human rights, women's rights, and sexual rights, right? Since the democratic opening in 1998. But the democratic opening did not only open the discussion for human rights, it also opened the whole sluices of Islamism, and actually I would say they won. So is this visibility an anomaly? Or is homophobia an anomaly, is my question, right? Because always already researchers on LGBT issues, and I just mentioned Tom Bilstorff or Evelyn Blackwood or also my own work, we also noted always the fear and the repression and the silence, right? Nobody talked that LGBT was accepted in general. Waria were visible on the streets, but they were also objected, right? I mean, you would never have a Waria being your boss when you're working in a bank or something like that, right? I mean, a Waria could be a sex worker or cut your hair, but that was it. It doesn't mean visibility, doesn't mean acceptance. They were still objected, even though Ali Siddiqui made an attempt to, kind of help them. So also there was a tradition of transgender practices in many parts here and there in the Indonesian archipelago, but this was always in a specific context. It didn't mean that LGBT in itself, same-sex desires were accepted. It's only that particular practice, that particular form, like in the Bugis, the Bisu, etc., that was accepted. So what I would say is that heteronormativity actually was always dominant, even though you had these certain forms of transgender practices and a certain a measure of visibility of Waria, particularly Waria, Banchi. So working on heteronormativity in Asia, I made a sliding scale of heteronormativity, in particularly in Indonesia, from a women's perspective. You can say that the heterosexually married wife is on top of that scale. It's Rubin's charmed circle. And just down there, you get widows, and you have good widows who are not sexually active. You have bad widows who are very sexually active, right? You've got, in the scale of the prostitution, there's also a hierarchy. The escort girls or massage girls are higher than the street sex workers. And also in LGBT issues, there's even though they are, I would say on a similar scale as the sex workers, the androgynous lesbian woman or the femme lesbian, I'm talking about women here, right, is more accepted than the particular butch lesbian woman. So there's always hierarchy and everybody is always looking upwards. But we do have this scare now, right? Just some examples. There were raids on in 2017 on suspected. You can be suspected now of lesbianism. In Aceh, of course, it's very clear. Men were flogged. the forced HIV testing, raids in spas, etc., etc. And these are the guys who are doing this. And this is the kind of things that, that you can see on the streets. Muslim fight against lesbian, gay, bisex, and transgender. Tolak refuse LGBT. And in this year, 2018, already the administration of Depok, where we live, announced to set up a task force, including police officers and religious leaders, to anticipate the spread of LGBT, right? As if you can, it's a tsunami or something like that. So what is the effect is that all the activists that I've worked with for 3 or 4 decades are now afraid to meet me in their offices and for them to go to their offices themselves, because when they're in their offices, they're open to attack, right? And particularly when there is a bully in their offices, they're visible. That all kinds of funding have stopped. So all the kinds of outreach work that they did and their websites and their activities, they can't get funding anymore. And their use of social media is totally restricted, only to very close kind of SOSMED groups. And particularly, of course, for young LGBT people, it is disastrous. I mean, they have no home of support anymore. They can't get any information anymore, in Indonesia at least, right? And the strange thing is also that very often the parents are blamed. I mean, homosexuality is seen as a sin or as a disease or as a crime, but it's all to do, also the same thing that we just heard this just now, sorry, about disability. The families have been somehow wanting, and particularly, of course, men. Here, men are culpable because they haven't got a good example for their sissy boys, right? They haven't been manly enough. So men must be manly, otherwise their boys will end up on the streets. So here we have an example of a raid, and the police sent these boys, they were men from gay sauna, to be medically and psychologically tested, right? But here is an example of one of the stories about transgender practices. This is a story that I discovered myself and that I'm very happy with. I gave the story to KPI and they were very, very happy to see that they had a history. So even though transgender is not, was accepted and is no longer a guarantee, still to have a history was there. This is a story of Bima Swarga. Bima going to hell to rescue his parents, and while there, like Dante, he went around and saw all the people being punished, right? This is in Bali. And he came towards two Banshee, one M2F, one F2M, and he asked Yama, Yama, what's this? I can't see any problem here, right? And Yama said, no, 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 no. There is no problem here. This is just something out of the ordinary. We didn't understand it, but there's no problem, no crime, no sin. They will go to heaven very soon. So when I give this story to my activist colleagues, they put it up as a big poster and they were so happy with it. And of course, Nariswari is also a very important figure, particularly in East Java, but in other parts of Java also. This half male, half female godhead is very important. And when I showed the first, my group of butch friends, Adanari statues, they cried. They said, we have a history, we exist, right? And that's why one of the largest groups in Jakarta is called Adanari Institute, because of this. And it's still there, right? I mean, the Adanari dance, with the veils, the Varia dance it. So there is history, but what does it mean? It doesn't mean very much, because we are confronted with what I call post-colonial amnesia, in which the gender and sexual diversity of Indonesia is ignored or is seen as a Western import. And particularly, of course, by the colonial power holders. The Dutch thought this was totally pagan and bad, and they tried to control it. But now the post-colonial leaders also control it, and they go back to a tradition as if it was always heteronormative. So the emphasis on morality and heteronormativity came via the Dutch to the post-colonial leaders. So we have these two sexual moral panics. As I said, the first one was around Lubang Buaya. Here we have the Pancasila Sakti monument. And this is the issue in which you see the violence, the alleged violence and depravity of the communist girls. The present campaign learned from that in the sense that it's again the imposition of, in this case, patriarchal Muslim regulations. They're already there. I mean, the creeping criminalization is already going on, not only at the national level, but particularly at the regional level. The first forms of criminalization were with the Perda, right? And of course, the 2008 anti-pornography law. We've already heard the issue of the ILA that was discussed in one of the previous sessions, and now there is this anti-LGBT law in preparation. Here we have an example of what you see around, how the communist phobia and the gay phobia, the homophobia are linked. Here they say communist and LGBT, we are obliged to destroy, we must fight the seeds of communism and LGBT. And this is what you see. There are many of these banners. They're all over the country. And it's just there to see, to have this kind of black listing of abjecting of people. So how do they do it? So this homophobic campaign is, I said, moral sexual panic. And the association is that all gay people are pedophiles, including lesbians. How they do that, I don't know. Anyway, doesn't matter. Yeah, I mean, there are technicalities involved, right? They're not Indonesian, they're foreign influence, right? So the transgender practices are ignored. They don't belong to the nation, right? The nation is pure, the nation is religious, the nation is moral, corrupt, but moral, right? Anti-religion, right? They can't be Muslim. This actually creates lots of problems for lots of the Muslim LGBT people who would like to belong to the masjid and go and pray, but they're not allowed. The idea is not so much on LGBT individuals, but particularly on the propaganda and the organization, because from there it is idea that it is menular, right? It spreads like a virus. Our children are being poisoned, and of course it goes with criminalization. And also with a lot of stigmatization. I mean, there were lots of, like in Sri Mulat, all kinds of varia figures on TV, right? You don't see them anymore, it's banned. A male person showing feminine behavior on television is immediately banned. Now, right. The methods are distortion, violence, use of militias, criminalization, the arrests and the raid, exclusion. It's very difficult for them to get proper jobs now. Control over the media. High-level political figures are saying the strangest things. Like, I mean, we saw one of them, Hovifa, on one of the slides just now. Hovifa was the Minister of Women's Affairs in just after Reformasi, when she was introducing human rights speak, right? Now she's saying that we need to ban and cure homosexuals. There are several ways. One is boil them. She's serious about that. She says, I've such a wonderful treatment. You know, you put them in a big pot, you boil them, you put some spices, and then, oops, like frogs, the homosexuality will go out. Or ruqya, right? When people are praying and some ustads pray some Islamic verses, and then the Islamic verses will work with I don't know what, something in the brains, and then you're cured, right? So this is what actually quite usually sensible persons say. So the themes are anti-religion, anti-Panchasila, amoral, and the effects are disidentification, dehumanization. The other is the abject, the nation is pure, religious, etc. And in the same time, violent scripts are being naturalized, right? I mean, you're wajib to destroy them. And of course, there's the addiction to the moral but intolerant, fragile nation. Why? Religion is the pretext. Islamization, of course, is the context. Militias are used for the work. The army cannot do. You can't put the army on the street, right, to beat up, but you can do the militias. The army, of course, is profiting from this. It is using a discourse of proxy war, right? Particularly because there's no use for an army in Indonesia, right? There are no enemies from invading Indonesia from any kind of neighboring country, right? So the army needs to struggle to keep its budget, right? So then they better create enemies like communists and LGBT people. Of course, in the context of the 2019 elections, and of course to counter the visibility of the human, women's and sexual rights movement. The struggle, of course, is for the soul of the nation, to make it maintain its heteronormative, anti-communist, religious stand. And what we, of course, hope is stop homophobia and all other phobias. Thank you.
Saskia, thank you, as always, a wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. Hendri, Yulius, please come and join us.
The year 2016 was marked by unprecedented hostility toward LGBT individuals. Between January to May 2016, state officials, religious leaders, the press, civil society organizations, all made publicly derogatory statements describing LGBT people as a product of Western intervention, the embodiment of a proxy war between the West and Indonesia, insatiable sexual creatures, pedophilia, and in one case, their identity is even considered as a result of the overconsumption of instant noodles. So don't eat noodle too much, okay? So that's the lesson learned. Of course, the effect of this development is twofold. While LGBT, the term LGBT has entered the daily vernacular of Indonesians, it is also increasingly perceived as a threat to the nation. Interestingly, it has also become a single term to describe any person with non-heterosexual or with non-heterosexuality or non-conforming gender expressions, including effeminate man. No wonder someone like myself is nowadays frequently referred to as LGBT instead of a gay man. So I can be gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender all at the same time. So, in the wake of such increasing anti-LGBT attitudes in public, the questions about how LGBT activists resist, alongside the strategies that they deploy to counter these homophobic discourses, are the primary focus of my presentation today. One of the main activist tactics is actually through constructing a specific knowledge about LGBT identity and sexuality. Through this construction, the activists try to create its connections with national belonging. Their strategies can be summed up into two. First, in what I call the localization of LGBT identity, the LGBT activists localize their identity by drawing discursive connections between modern gay identity and indigenous homosexual or transgender practices. Secondly, the arrival of the term SOGIE, or sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, has led the activists to merge that term with the national mottos unity in diversity, manifesting in the newly introduced term SOGIE diversity and SOGIE minority. However, such process of localization of gay identity is not something new, because activists has practiced it since the early emergence of gay identity in Indonesia. In the next slides, I will trace such localization practices and situating them in the shift of the country politics. Let me begin with the construction of gay identity in the early 80s. The early emergence of gay identity and lesbian identity in Indonesia took place in New Order era. In the early 1980s, discussions of homosexuality in media suddenly proliferated and flourished. Some discourses indicated that homosexuality was an inborn trait, something that has to be accepted. But many others also established a discursive connection between homosexuality and psychological problems, particularly dysfunctional family structures and psychological conflicts. Among the most prominent discourses of homosexuality were the ways in which homosexuality was understood as the result of failed sociality, in a way that homosexuality is caused by social environment or dysfunctional family structures. At this historical juncture, the state ideology was also deployed through heteronormative and reproductive family principle. The state was governed as a family institution through what we call asas kekeluargaan, or family principle. As such, the heterosexual family and marriage were naturalized as the foundational basis of the nation state. And also, heterosexual marriage was marked as the ideal adulthood and citizenship. As the result, the interplay between the state heteronormative ideology and the abnormalization of homosexuality led to the fact that in many cases, Indonesian homosexual men to lead double lives as both gay and heterosexually married. Many gay men in this period also saw themselves as sakit, or having a particular form of illness. As gay identity carried Western connotations and also the increasing pressures to enter heterosexual marriage, the local activists strategically attempted to localize gay identity as well as encourage gay men to confidently embrace gay identity. The process of localization was achieved through drawing a discursive continuity between indigenous local homosexual practices or transgender practices with modern gay identity. Accounts like male same-sex relations or practices and local dance with cross-dresser performance in some specific cultural domain was used and to justify that gay subjectivity has existed since the ancient Indonesia. Simultaneously, this discursive connection between modern homosexuality with indigenous practices produced an argument that the authentic Indonesian cultures were actually tolerant of homosexuality. Consequently, negative attitudes toward homosexuality were understood as a result of the contamination of foreign entities, for example, monotheistic religions and also Western bourgeois values. So that's the connection, the entanglement between the local and global discourses in shaping the local understanding of homosexuality. Now we move to the early 1990s, when concerns of HIV/AIDS and reproductive health has entered Indonesia. Humanitarian support to prevent HIV and also address HIV among gay community has led activists to refashion public health discourses and use it to draw another connection between modern gay identity and personal well-being. Closeted gay men were considered more vulnerable to HIV infections because they were difficult to be reached out by activists or health workers. So in a way, they promoted that being openly gay, embracing your gay identity is one of the markers of personal well-being. And important and information about sexual health circulating in Indonesia during this period also mainstream sexual identities / gender identities as an important mode of well-being. As part of the effort to detach gay identity from Western connection, as well as to discourage gay men from heterosexual marriage, gay men or gay activists also constructed what I call 100% gay discourse. So in a way that if you are purely gay, you cannot be a heterosexual person. Boys will be boys, girls will be girls, and gay will always be gays. So 100% gay was a form of discourse that was used by gay activists during that time. And now we move to the democratic era, wherein transnational humanitarian support for HIV, sexual rights, and also the rising conservative religious conservatisms have created another form of moral panic against LGBT. The collapse of the New Order regime signals the democratization of Indonesia. What is surprising from this transition is that the transition to democracy has opened up opportunities for conservative political Islam to acquire more political power. Merging Islamic discourse with nationalist sentiments, these groups spread moral panic around issues of sexuality, positioning themselves as the guardian of the nation morality. Their violent assaults on queer events, for example, were justified as a means of protecting the nation and guarding the morality of Indonesian youth from the corrupting Western influence. These conservative attitudes, according to Catherine Robinson, were also reflected in political Islam's strategic attempts to institute Sharia-based law through backdoor advocacy. They were made possible by the policy of decentralization, which was part of the new government's democratic agenda. As such, under these policies, the central government devolved greater power and flexibility to provincial governments to enact their own administrations. Then the conservatives used this mode to institutionalize laws against homosexuality. As such, homosexuality or LGBT identity has been increasingly institutionalized in some local ordinances, conflating homosexuality with immorality, abnormality, and demand the government to treat them as equally similar with alcohol consumption, gambling, and prostitution. But the conservative exploitation of the issues of LGBT is not possible if such issues do not become global and attract their attention. And this is my next point, the globalization of LGBT identities and rights. So first, there has been transnational support to local NGOs to promote sexual rights and LGBT rights within this democratic era. Secondly, increasingly we know that sexual orientation and gender identity has been perceived as a basis of citizenship rights. For example, we can see it from the enactment of the Yogyakarta Principles, which explicitly mentions sexual orientation and gender identity should be recognized and protected by the state. Next, because of these two aspects of development, of course, there has been the increasing visibility of LGBT activism in Indonesia. The increased visibility of LGBT activism in Indonesia can also be seen clearly with the popularization of the term LGBT and SOGIE, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So, as the term LGBT becomes popular at the local level, the term SOGIE was considered by activists as an attempt to move beyond the rhetoric of LGBT and to navigate the negative attitudes that have been attached to the term LGBT. The interplay between religious conservatisms and the globalization of LGBT rights bring us to the last point of our discussion: the creation and deployment of SOGIE discourse by the local activists. So this is the SOGIE model that activists always use in their advocacy and training sessions. The concept of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expressions as discrete elements of an individual's gender and sexual subjectivity has provided activists with a means to counter the conservative narratives that always or largely conflate sexual orientation with gender expression. For example, in many discourses, effeminate man or masculine woman has been perceived as LGBT. But in fact, gender expression and sexual orientation here are two discrete and different individuals' elements. So activists use this tool to counter this kind of discourse. But the activists also merge SOGIE with other words to create more localized understanding and strategy. First is the invention of SOGIE diversity, or keberagaman SOGIE, keberagaman gender and sexualitas, or just keberagaman. They use the term SOGIE diversity to merge SOGIE into Indonesia's official national motto, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, or Unity in Diversity. Central to this slogan is the nation's claim to diversity as a component of its unitary identity. As a nation with numerous ethnicities, languages, and faiths, Indonesia celebrates diversity while also emphasizing the unity of its peoples. In brief, differences are not seen as a source of conflict because they are all legitimate components of Indonesian nationhood. When SOGIE is associated with the notion of diversity, it not only becomes a successful example of the localization of the discourses of sexuality, but it also situates non-normative sexualities and genders as intrinsic parts or inherent parts of the nationhood project. The next invention in relation to SOGIE is the creation of SOGIE minorities. The use of the term SOGIE minorities does not only forge solidarity and allegiance between different sexual subjects, but also it helps activists to roll in people with non-normative genders and sexualities that do not label themselves as LGBT individuals. Secondly, the use of the term SOGIE and also SOGIE minority promotes the idea that gender and sexuality is actually universal aspects of human being, and also it highlights the fact that gender and sexuality can be used as a basis for discriminatory practices. So in a way, the use of the term SOGIE broadened their political allegiance, not only with LGBT activists or LGBT individuals, but also with feminist movements. Because nowadays, feminist movements in Indonesia also has increasingly adopted and used the discourses of SOGIE in their advocacy and training. Even in many cases, feminist movements are largely our primary supports to speak in public and to defend LGBT rights. So there are three main points that I like to highlight in this presentation before I close this presentation. So first, as we have seen, there has been transnational encounters between activists with sexuality discourse that enable them actually to resist heteronormative society. But in this kind of transnational encounters, we shouldn't devalue or invalidate the activist attempts as, we shouldn't see them as a merely victim of colonialism or imperialism of Western sexuality discourse. Because what we have seen here is that they actively refashioned, reconfigured Western sexuality discourse and try to fit it within local discourses and also local challenges. So in a way that global and local here is becoming hybrid, becomes very entangled and blurry. So in a way that's their strategy to localize their identity, but also to differentiate themselves with the westernized gay and lesbian subjectivity. Last but not least, from this strategy, we can see how the activists actually activists always see their sexuality or gender identity in connections or in relation with national belonging. So in a way, they seek acceptance by saying that I'm local, I'm also Indonesians. This brings me to a reflection on the mainstream queer theory, which is actually coming from the North American model. In queer theory, in the mainstream queer theory model, because of its commitment to post-structuralism, it always tries to construct the truth or the strategy of activism to be, or to push activists or queer people to be outside of the nation. In a way, we have to resist the nation. We have to be critical. But here, as we can see, actually, in Indonesia, it's different. It's totally different because the activists or LGBT individuals are actually seeking for social acceptance from the nation state. So that was my presentation. And to close this presentation, I would like to thank Greg Philly and Ronit Ritchie for inviting me to speak here. Thank you.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Hendri. We have, because our speakers were so perfectly timed, thank you, we have about 10 minutes for discussion or for questions. We have one immediately here, and then we'll take 3 more as people gather their thoughts. The mic just here.
Thank you for the opportunity that you guys give to me. My name is Arif. I would like to ask 2 questions actually. First is, where do we have to start to change the stigma of everybody in Indonesia when we try to struggle to afford the LGBT right, but everybody, when we start talking about that, they will come back to the religion. And then, yeah, especially everybody that we know, so many people in Indonesia, even though they are gay, they belong to one religion. And then it's always shut my mouth every time when I want to struggle about this right, when they come back to my religion that I belong to. And then the second is about the identity. When we try to forget about the identity, and actually inside of the gay community, they already have the identity that they create for themselves to find the better partner or to find the match partner that they think they will match with. Like, if we are talking about gay, bisexual, and then transgender, and then probably the things that the speakers don't talk in the presentation that I always find at the gay community, they're always talking about top and bottom. They always talk about more manly or more feminine. If you are more feminine, I'm more feminine, we're not gonna match. So so if we forget about this identity, so how they can find the match partner? Thank you for that.
We'll start with this one if you'd like to respond, and then we'll take it there.
Where can we start? We cannot ignore religion in Indonesia. That's very clear. So you must start also. You must also start with religion, right? And it's not impossible. I mean, all religions, every religion that I've ever studied or learned about or belonged to or whatever, has a possibility to be very regressive and conservative and aggressive and to be very positive. Every religion has that. So Islam also has that. And there are some ways in which we can approach and work with Islam. We work in East Java, mostly with the group called Gus Durian. Have you heard of that? Yeah, it's a small group of ulama, young Islamic teachers who are able to integrate feminist and human rights and an LGBT perspective within Islam. They call themselves, after Gus Dur, of course. and then durian, right? So, and Goes durian, yeah. And they're a small group, but they're becoming more influential. So that's one group that we deal with. We've also worked a lot with scholars, Islamic scholars, like Mustaq Mulia. Have you heard of her? She has been able to elaborate beautiful theories about how to integrate human rights into an Islamic Muslim framework, because, I mean, it's very well possible to do that. And within a human rights framework, you can also have an LGBT rights framework. And so it is possible to do that, and we have got to work with progressive Muslim groups, because if you try to ignore religion, I mean, you don't get anywhere. And you've also got to work, of course, with LGBT Muslim individuals and groups and try to support them. And we try to do that in our work. The identity issue, that's an interesting question. When I first came to Indonesia and met some, in my case then, lesbian women, they were strictly divided, right? Kantul, Sentil, and Santul, and I had to also belong to that. I came from a very feminist lesbian encounters in Holland at the time, and I refused. And so we had this clash, right? They said, we can only go out with you once we know who you are and what you are. I said, but I'm a feminist, right? I'm a woman. No, 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 that's not important. What are you? Are you a butch or femme, right? So that was absolutely the most important thing about me. And, huh? What did I do? Well, I was very deficient. My watch was not manly enough, and there were lots of things. I was deficient in many ways, right? But anyway, I got a... well, don't talk about that. When we have some drinks, we can talk about but I tried to work with them from a feminist perspective, right? I said, because I mean, there were also some feminist lesbians at the time, and we said, what can we do with this? I mean, what is the problem? Is butch femme the problem? Or is the kind of actual oppression or violence the problem, right? Because there was some violence in these butch femme relationships. And we decided it's not butch femme that's the problem. That's an erotic pattern that you can follow or not, or can adapt. It's the possible violence, the intrusion of heteropatriarchy that is the problem. And so we had a first workshop in 1983 about patriarchy and lesbianism, and talking about that, of course, violence is actually the problem. And so then, since then, actually, like the women who are now with Andanari, because I've met them so many years ago, they said, okay, we can be butch, we'll remain butch, but we'll be feminist butches, right? So now, so then we had a lot of, so not patriarchal butches, but feminist butches, gentle, nice feminist butches. And it's possible. And then, so now with Adanari Institute, and that's actually one of the topics that I'm going to write about, there are 3 generations of butch femme couples, right? The old ones, the traditional ones that I met in the early 80s, and then there's a middle group who are, and then there's a young group of very vibrant, young, lovely butch femme couples. There are also other kinds of other identity. It's not the only identity anymore, so that has spread out. I don't know how it is with gay men, but I mean, this has spread, so there's still this butch femme dynamic, also among the younger ones. But there's also other kinds, say no label, right? Or androgynous, or priyavan, or whatever. I mean, it's an enormous, and there are different terms. There are local terms. There are new terms. Like priyavan is actually from Varia, actually, right? So Varia and priyaman. Priyaman is you're woman born, but you have a masculine soul, and all that. And they are actively engaging, but also shifting now. That's interesting. The earlier butch femme was...
Sorry, Saskia. We might just create space for a couple
sorry.
of questions. But this is certainly a dinner discussion to continue.
Yeah, so there's fluidity now. People can change. That's what I want to say. Sorry, sorry.
Did you agree?
Okay, I think I will answer
You're
the
right.
question about top and bottom. Yeah, if you feel that my answer is really good, then I have to change my career to be a director of dating agency for gay men. So yeah, whenever a guy asks me whether I'm top or bottom, I will just answer it depends on my mood. So in a way that, yeah. I mean, top and bottom, I mean, that kind of policing is actually only one form of discourses among gay community, because nowadays I've increasingly seen a lot of gay men try to be more fluid in terms of sexual roles. Even if you Google, if you read some recently published articles in some alternative media by gay men, they try to deconstruct this kind of binary sex roles. So that's what I increasingly see among gay community in Indonesia. And the second question about religion, yes, that's the most important thing, because we cannot ignore the role of religion in Indonesian society. But now, to be honest, I have to express my confusion as well about the recent activist strategy, because in a way to counter these homophobic discourses, the activists try to conjure up a discourse of respectable LGBT identity. Oh, I'm gay, but I'm smart. Oh, I'm gay, but I'm very successful. In a way that I'm afraid if this kind of discourse will lead to conditional acceptance. You are accepted because you are economically productive. You are accepted because you have what? Six-pack abs, for example. So this is, yeah, I mean, this is quite, I mean, for me, to be honest, this is quite confusing. I don't have the answer, but learning from the queer, I mean, this is a good thing about North American queer theory, that it helps me to see, oh, this is the limit, and probably we have to think further about this. Thank you.
We're almost at time, but we'll just take two questions that are waiting. One at the back here. Yes, could you just, with the blue top on you? Yes, yes. And then to Terry. If we could just make the questions quick, and we'll need fairly quick answers. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just gonna...
Just project.
I actually have a question in relation to the overlap with the religious identity that you were talking about before. So, I mean, we've been hearing a lot now about, sort of, particularly among the young people, like the hijra movement and sort of being sort of more conservative in sort of like piety and all that. I was wondering whether you also see evidence of like this sort of hijra, more hijra attitudes within the LGBT community, and how Muslim gays and lesbians sort of reconcile that sort of pressure to hijra.
Thank you. And we'll just take the final question from Terry at the same time.
Thank you very much. I'll just say one word, the pesantren. Can you tell me, is this a real issue about identity versus behavior? Because it's quite clear that throughout the pesantren community, homosexual behavior is widespread, exploitation of young children is widespread, and yet this is a no-go zone in terms of public discussion. Here in Australia, we have royal commissions to look into these things. In Indonesia, it is ignored. How does this fit in the whole discussion?
Okay.
No, I was first just now.
Okay. All right. Okay. So thank you, Charlotte, for your question. So, in terms of how LGBT individuals reconcile with their religious identity, of course, I've also seen a lot of activists, gay and lesbian activists, and also transgender activists are working on this, how to do new interpretations of religious text to reconcile their sexual desire and religious identity. But since I'm working on Islamic, the discourses around Islamic therapy for LGBT people. So I also found that this kind of religious discourse have been used by the Peduli Sahabat. So this is a new Islamic aversion therapy organizations. So they claim that they can cure LGBT people to be heterosexual using Islamic text. And in their discourses, in its discourse, the Peduli Sahabat saw that, understand that sexual orientation, like homosexual desire, is actually already inborn with that person, in that person. But that homosexual desires should be treated as a form of the test or trial from God. So you have to address that desires by restraining yourself from sexual acts and try to enter heterosexual marriage. So this is a kind of anti-LGBT discourses that are using religious texts but still treat sexual orientation as something inherent, or sexual desire as something inherent in your subjectivity. And also about identity versus behavior. In pesantren, yeah, we have heard a lot about it, but to be honest, I think among activists, we also still have confusion how to distinguish identity and behavior, because one time I saw an activist saying that in defending or in responding to the anti-LGBT attitudes, an activist said, "Oh, but gay sexuality is everywhere, even in pesantren." So this kind of discourse indicate the way that this activist sees the homosexual practices in pesantren as gay identity, in a way that we need to rethink further about the gayization or LGBTization of sexual practices, sexual behaviors, and other form of sexual desires that might not fall neatly into LGBT identity, but we LGBTize them. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Hendri. I'm a bit more worried about what happens in the pesantren, and I'm hoping that a Me Too movement will come up soon, because what's happening there is pure rape, often, right? Sexual violence. And I'm very disturbed by the hypocrisy of the Islamic clergy, in which on the one hand they say LGBT is out and immoral, but on the other hand, in the pesantren, these kinds of behavior goes on and on and on. And we, with our groups, we have met many cases of young boys and young girls who were raped in the pesantren and could not do anything about that. So I think it's a big scandal brewing, and Indonesia is not learning from what's happening in the Catholic Church at the moment. And I don't see a Me Too movement yet, but I really hope it will come pretty soon, and that the Islamic clergy will be exposed for their own hypocrisy. Yeah. So, and behavior or identity, I couldn't care less, it's rape. Anyway, but not, of course, not all of it, but quite a few, honestly. And I've talked to very traumatized individuals, both women and men, right? But talking about, in my interviews with people who identify both as lesbian or whatever term they used, women attracted to women and being very religious, quite confusion. Many of them really felt burdened by a sense of shame and guilt, and said, I must change my ways because it's not done. Others, like particularly the butch women, in whatever term they use for themselves, felt confused also, because outside they presented themselves as laki-laki, as men, but inside they said, but Allah knows who I'm truly, right? And so, but they didn't want to go and pray with the mukana, right, with the women's veil. But they couldn't also pray in a male dress or in the mosque, because Allah would know who I can deceive the whole world, but not Allah, right? So that created quite a confusion. On the other hand, the wave of Islamization now, you see it also among, at least I see it among lesbian activists, more and more of whom are, this is the last sentence, are wearing the jilbab.
There is much more to discuss. Please do continue to talk about these issues over coffee outside the formal session. Just before we close, I've been asked to deliver a message about dinner, which is at the Delphi 6. I am reliably informed that there are no instant noodles on the menu, so no need for moral panic. If you have registered and paid for the dinner and would like to be accompanied to the dinner, to the venue, please meet in the foyer here at 6 o'clock and someone will come and walk with you to the restaurant. If you know where it is, please feel free to go on your own. There are no more places, so if you haven't registered and paid, unfortunately the dinner's full. We'll be back here at 9 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning, so enjoy your evening, but please join with me in thanking Saskia Wieringa and Hendri Yulius for a fantastic set of presentations.